Dear friends, welcome to tonight's episode of People of Interest series. What an incredible evening, an incredible pleasure and privilege to host our guests of honor in the plural. So I'm going to give a word or two about Michael, but then hand it over to our very own Vlad, who will share a few words of introduction to our guest of honor, a real hero for all humanity, especially in the Jewish community, someone who has stood up to injustice and has celebrated the divine image in all humanity, and has really, I would say, sacrificed for the truth and for standing up for his principles. We'll hear about that a little bit later, momentarily. Lord Ian Austin, who will introduce our guest of honor, the wonderful writer, the author of an incredible, gripping, and increasingly relevant book and piece of history, Michael Smith. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Vlad Berman, who, as many of you know, has taken a tremendous part in developing our programming, our guests of honor, our speakers from all the spectrums, from the academy, from film, art, history, etc. Without further ado, Vlad.
Rabbi, thank you very much. You know, normally when we do these events in person, this is the time to invite the audience to applaud Rabbi Mendel and give him a really strong hand, because you guys are on mute. We won't do that, but I think inside, Rabbi, we applaud your efforts on behalf of London Jewry and through Zoom, actually, probably your global reach. I have a wonderful and easy job today, which is to introduce Lord Ian Austin, a man who needs no introduction and about whom not enough good things can be said. So Ian is a former four-time MP and minister under Gordon Brown. He is a terrific friend and ally of our community in good times and in bad times. He was one of the very early critics, before that became consensus, of Jeremy Corbyn and his anti-Semitism while being a Labour MP. And he was instrumental in unearthing and uncovering that anti-Semitism and bringing it into the public domain. Today, Ian is a Lord, thankfully, and sits in the House of Lords, and he's also the Prime Ministerial Trade Envoy to Israel. Ian has a very special connection to Frank Foley, in that as an MP for Dudley, where Frank Foley retired, Ian built a memorial which was unveiled by Prince William in 2018 to commemorate Frank Foley's life. And I think those of us who have read the book, which I highly recommend, know that Frank Foley was so very remarkable, not only because of what he did, which was tremendous, but because there were so very few people like him. And I think we know that Ian Austin is somebody who has always been on the right side of history. Please God, will never be called upon in those sorts of circumstances, but we know that we can count on Ian. And as we say, Ian, you're a true mensch, and it's really a pleasure to have you here with us. Again, we'll do another round of internal applause for you, and I'll hand over to you to introduce Michael. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Vladimir. What you say to me is, look, it's deeply appreciated, but it's, it's too kind. And it's, the truth is this, nobody should be thanking someone who was a Labour MP for standing up to racism. I just felt it was, a basic requirement of the job. So I very much appreciate what you've said, and all your support and friendship to me over the years. And I want to thank you as well for, Vladimir, for everything you do for the Jewish community in the UK and in Germany and abroad as well. So thank you very much for that. And let me thank you as well, Rabbi Mendel, for your leadership and teachings, all you do for the community at Chabad Belgravia. And let me thank Olivia as well for making all the arrangements and enabling me to be here with you all this evening. It's an incredible turnout. It's clearly a huge tribute to you, Rabbi Mendel, to everybody at Belgravia, that you've built this online community and that you're able to meet and sustain each other despite the pandemic. Now, look, it's a great privilege for me to introduce Michael Smith this evening. Michael served in the British Army's Intelligence Corps before becoming an award-winning journalist for the BBC, the Daily Telegraph and the Sunday Times. He's now a full-time novelist and intelligence historian. He's the author of a number of brilliant books on intelligence issues. And we're going to hear tonight about Foley, the spy who saved 10,000 Jews. And as Vladimir just said, I urge you to read this book. It really is a great book. It's unputdownable. It reads like a spy thriller. It is the most amazing story about real courage and true heroism. So we're going to hear tonight about a great British hero, someone who took huge risks to save other people. I'm not going to say too much about Frank Foley. I'll leave that to Michael, who's the world's leading expert on the great man's life and work. But I do want to say this, that I've met a number of people now, obviously very elderly, but who are able to escape as babies from Nazi Germany because Frank Foley provided the papers their fathers, their parents needed to escape. And it's a very moving thing to think about the lives he saved, the thousands of children, grandchildren that have lived, the contribution they've made to our country, to our world, because of his bravery. I also want to say a little in this introduction about what he teaches us. Frank Foley didn't have to be Jewish to know that anti-Semitism, prejudice, hatred, and persecution were wrong. He didn't have to be Jewish to know whose side he was on. He took huge personal risks to save 10,000 Jewish people from the Holocaust. And he didn't do this for fame or for honors, for payment or rewards. In fact, he retired in total anonymity. He did it simply because it was the right thing to do. You'll all have seen, I'm sure, Schindler's List, but Frank Foley saved more people than Oskar Schindler. Yet this small, bespectacled, seemingly ordinary man lived out a quiet retirement with his family in a place called Stourbridge, a small town in Dudley. But despite growing up there and being interested in these issues, my dad was a refugee whose family were murdered in Treblinka. So I've always been interested in Holocaust commemoration, remembrance. But I'd never heard, none of us had ever heard of Frank Foley until Michael wrote his brilliant book. And I think what his life and his courage really teach us is that we all have a responsibility to stand up against intolerance and racism. It teaches us as well that ordinary people have it within themselves to find the courage to take risks, to take extraordinary decisions, and to do what is right in the service of others. There is now a plaque at the embassy in Berlin where he worked. As Vladimir said, we raised the funds for a statue which was unveiled by His Royal Highness, the Duke of Cambridge, a couple of years ago. That project also resulted in bronze busts which have been placed in the auditorium at the MI6 headquarters of Vauxhall Cross and in the ambassador's waiting room at the Foreign Office. I think that is fantastic, by the way. I love the idea that ambassadors from despotic regimes, from dictatorships, from totalitarian regimes around the country, when they visit the Foreign Office, they have to sit there being stared at by this bust of this great symbol of Britain's values of democracy and freedom and fairness and tolerance. I think that's a fantastic symbol. I think most important of all, as a result of Michael's book, he's honoured in the Avenue of Remembrance at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. As a result of Michael's work, which we'll be hearing about this evening, this man is now properly remembered. His story has been heard by and inspired politicians, prime ministers, and our future king. MI6 boss, Alex Younger, said that normally our successes are private, our failures public. It is a wonderful thing for MI6 that one of its most distinguished members' successes are no longer private. Werner Lachs, who was issued a visa by Frank Foley in 1939, said, "The courageous and brave actions of Frank Foley made it possible for me to escape hell of Nazi Germany. But for him, I too would have been a victim of the Holocaust. He was my savior. I shall always honor and cherish his memory." And Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis said, "The sheer scale of what Frank Foley achieved as the impending catastrophe of the Holocaust drew closer is among the very finest testimonies to human bravery." Thanks to Michael, Frank Foley is no longer an anonymous secret. His bravery is a story to inspire us all. This evening, we honour the great man's memory. And it is absolutely brilliant that you are all here this evening to remember him as well. And so without anything further from me, it is my privilege to introduce the award-winning journalist and author, Michael Smith, to speak to us this evening. Michael.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you, Ian. And thank you all for tuning in to listen to this. I feel very privileged to have such an audience there in front of me, including people from Norway, which is fantastic because Foley was in Norway when the invasion of Norway took place. He was acting there as an MI6 officer, and he helped during the retreat north and got the Norwegian royal gold out of Norway. So he had a Secret Service role, not involved in helping Jews there. But what we're here tonight to talk about is Foley's work, Saving Jews. On Friday, June 19th, 1959, a small group of people gathered on the edge of a windswept forest near Kibbutz Hurel, just outside Jerusalem. A grove of trees had been planted there to commemorate a remarkable Englishman. Each of the more than 2,000 pines had been paid for by someone he saved from Hitler's concentration camps. Contributions for more trees were coming in every day. The speakers at the ceremony included some of the most eminent members of the Jewish community in pre-war Berlin. Benno Cohen, chairman of the Zionist Organization of Germany, reminded those present that they had gathered to pay tribute to a British official who had saved tens of thousands of Jews from the Holocaust. He was the Pimpernel of the Jews, Cohen said. Day and night, he was at the disposal of those who sought help. In those days, he restored to many of us our faith in humanity. A memorial stone placed in front of the grave read simply, Major Francis Edward Foley, England, Memorial Grove. I first came across Frank Foley while researching a book about British espionage operations. I was told about a former member of MI6 whose brilliant operational ability was still held up as an example to new recruits, but whose most important claim to fame was that he had helped thousands of Jews to escape from the Holocaust. One former MI6 officer told me Foley was not just a brilliant spy, he was a near saint who had been described as Britain's Schindler. He was quite outstanding character, the MI6 man. Schindler pales into insignificance alongside his work on getting Jews out of Germany. He was a very, very able man who I don't think ever got the recognition he should have done. It was an impressive testimonial, but if Foley had done so much to help the Jews, why wasn't he better known? I asked Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Center in Israel, if Foley had ever been considered for the distinction of righteous among nations, an accolade accorded to a number of Gentiles, most notably, of course, Oskar Schindler, who helped to rescue Jews from the clutches of the Nazis. They told me that they had heard of Foley, but there was no evidence to back up the claims. Under its statutes, Yad Vashem needs living witnesses who could testify that they had been saved by Foley if he were to be recognized as someone who had rescued Jews from the Holocaust. But if the story were true, shouldn't it be told? Shouldn't Foley be recognized for what he had done? I decided that I had somehow to find the evidence that one way or another would answer the question, was Frank Foley really Britain's Schindler? Given the response from Yad Vashem, I was somewhat surprised when a copy of a document I'd requested from their archives arrived in the post. It was the memoirs of a Jewish aid worker called Hubert Pollack, and it described in some detail how Foley had saved tens of thousands of Jews from the Holocaust. It was only the first of many pieces of evidence that I have found, many of them in Israeli archives, and indeed placed there by some of the most senior members of Germany's pre-war Jewish community. all of them backing up Foley's claim to be regarded as righteous among nations. Frank Foley was born on November the 24th, 1884, in Highbridge in Somerset, where his father worked as a locomotive engineer for the Somerset and Dorset Railway Company. Foley's mother was a devout Catholic, and his earliest ambition was to become a priest. After spending 3 years at the French seminary, he decided instead on an academic career. When the First World War broke out, Foley took a commission in the British Army, but he was badly wounded on the Somme, and while recovering in England, was picked out as a candidate for Secret Service with the Army's Intelligence Corps. At the end of the war, he was recruited to work for MI6, the British Foreign Intelligence Service, taking charge of its station in Berlin. His cover was to be head of the British Passport Control Office, which controlled visas, issued visas to anyone wishing to go anywhere controlled by the British, a useful method of keeping watch on foreign spies trying to infiltrate the empire. Foley proved to be a brilliant intelligence officer, recruiting, among others, a Soviet spy who for years would keep the British informed of communist attempts to subvert the West. In the 1930s, as the threat from Moscow was gradually replaced by that posed by the Nazis, Foley also recruited a series of key German agents who would provide the Allies with details of the progress of Hitler's secret rocket and atomic programs. But increasingly, his time was occupied with more than espionage. He was having to work all hours to help Jews. After being appointed Chancellor in January 1933, Hitler had moved swiftly to consolidate his position. He used an arson attack on the Reichstag as an excuse to bring in emergency legislation, allowing his political opponents to be taken into so-called protective custody without the need for a warrant or a trial. On Thursday, March 9th, 1933, the first concentration camp was opened at Dachau near Munich. Within a month, 2 more had been built at Esterwagen and Sachsenhausen. Increasingly, the inmates of these camps were not just political prisoners, but non-Aryans, the Gypsies, and in particular, the Jews. Many of those members of the Jewish community in Germany who could afford to leave began to do so. Some headed for neighboring countries such as France and Holland, believing soon that the tide would turn and it would be safe to go home. Others looked for more permanent sanctuary in the Jewish homeland. Palestine was administered by Britain under mandate from the League of Nations. The mandate specifically urged the British to assist the Jews to go there, but a series of Arab revolts led to strict limits on the number of Jews allowed in. Those German Jews hoping to flee the Nazis therefore needed visas, which had to be obtained from the British Passport Control Office in Berlin, from Frank Foley. Within days of the new concentration camps opening, Foley's office was besieged by Jews seeking to leave, and he was telling his bosses in London that he was overwhelmed with applications from Jews who wanted to go to Palestine, to England, to anywhere in the British Empire. This is how Benno Cohen, chairman of the Zionist Organization of Germany, described Foley's reaction. There were British envoys in post in Berlin at that time who carried out London's policy to the letter, who were impervious to humanitarian considerations and who more often worked for the greater good of the Nazi regime in friendly cooperation with its ministers. One man stood out above all others. Captain Foley took advantage of his powers in so broad-minded a way that many who, under a stricter interpretation of orders, would probably have been refused, were issued with the coveted visas to Palestine. To many who had to deal with him, he appeared almost as a saint. Impressive testimonial indeed, but Foley was not simply a civil servant doing what he could to help. Foley was a British spy. He was running agents into the heart of the Nazi war machine. He had no diplomatic immunity. He could have been arrested at any time. Helping the Jews was not an activity designed to curry favour with either the Nazis or indeed his bosses in London, who were determined to keep the number of Jews emigrating to Palestine to a bare minimum. Foley was not simply broad-minded in his interpretation of the rules, he blatantly ignored them in order to allow Jews to leave the country. The Nazis were determined to drive the Jews out of all walks of German society, to make life so difficult for them that they had to go. Jewish businesses were sold off to Nazis at knockdown prices, often at the point of a gun. Jewish directors and managers were dismissed. No area of German society was to be tainted by the Jew. Business, the judiciary, the medical and dental professions, the universities and the schools, the media, even the arts were all to be cleansed of the Jew. This is Frank Foley himself in a dispatch to London in 1935, just 2 years after after Hitler came to power, and with the introduction of the final solution still 6 years away. No Jewish dentist may now be admitted as a panel dentist. No Jewish lawyer may now be admitted as a professional legal advisor. No apprentice may be entered to the publishing trade unless of Aryan origin. Almost all Jewish artists have been forbidden from exercising their calling. For the Jewish youth, the future holds out no prospects in Germany, and the greater part will be forced to emigrate. The liberal professions are now completely closed to them. One of the leading Jewish artists who received a letter from the so-called Chamber of Culture was the sculptor and potter, Wolfgang Meyer. After the Nazis came to power, Meyer quit his high-profile studio in Berlin and moved his mother and his young family out of the capital for what he hoped would be a quieter life in the countryside. Not only did he now find that he could no longer work, the persecution of the Jews was worse in the countryside than actually it was in Berlin. The family wanted to leave, but there was no chance of Meyer-Michael's elderly mother being granted entry to any of the countries taking Jews. When she died in 1935, Meyer-Michael tried unsuccessfully to go to England. The Meyer-Michaels decided they must try to get to Palestine. The massive influx of Jews in the immediate wake of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor sparked riots among the Arabs, and the British were sticking to very strict limits on the number of visas issued. They were available to dependents of those already living in Palestine and to those who had definite offers of job. But the jobs available there were almost exclusively agricultural or industrial, while most German Jews had been members of the professional and business classes, or like Meyer-Michael, employed in cultural occupations. For them, the only option was a capitalist visa, allowed to anyone who could show that they had £1,000, around £40,000 at today's values, to help them to start a new life. Naturally enough, people's money was tied up in their houses or businesses, but with so many Jews trying to emigrate, it was virtually impossible to sell a house or business for anything more than a fraction of the real value. Even the limited amount of money you might get from sale of your property would not be yours to keep. If you had more than 50,000 marks or had earned more than 20,000 marks in any 1 year, you had to pay a 25% flight tax. The remainders of your marks were then paid into a blocked bank account with the German central bank, which transferred the £1,000 to Palestine. But this was not only done at a highly punitive rate of exchange. The German economy was isolated from the outside world, and the central bank only had limited amounts of sterling. It could take years for people's money to be released to Palestine. The Meyer-Michaels barely had the £1,000 they needed, and this was in a blocked account with no guarantee it would ever be transferred to Palestine. Until it was, Foley could not give them visas. But he told Meyer-Michael there was perhaps a way out. Did he not know someone who could write him a letter promising that the money was available? One of Meyer Michael's relatives had emigrated to Amsterdam when the Nazi persecutions began and had established his own bank. He agreed to draw up two documents. In one, he promised to lend Meyer Michael £1,000. In a second, Meyer Michael declared the first document invalid and promised never to use it. He took the banker's promise of £1,000 to Foley. The whole thing was a ploy, Meyer Michael said. Mr. Foley knew that as well as I, but he said enthusiastically that this was marvellous and he would give me the visa immediately. Within half an hour, I had the precious document in my hand. I shall be forever grateful to this truly good man. In a dispatch back to London, Foley complained that Meyer Michael's problems were not unusual. The position of the Jew in Germany, even if he possesses capital, is therefore a desperate one, Foley said. He is being ruined economically, and at the same time, he is unable to emigrate as he cannot obtain the release of even a modest proportion of his capital sufficient to enable him to do so. Bertold Khan, a Jewish lawyer in Zweibrücken, southwest Germany, had served in the German army during the First World War. He won the Iron Cross. But when the Nazis came to power, the stormtroopers mounted guard on his chambers with a sign ordering people not to use Jewish lawyers. The stormtroopers pushed him down the steps of the law courts, and his non-Jewish clients took their business elsewhere. Khan's daughter, Elspeth, came home to find him in despair. His world had collapsed, she said. He was sitting in an absolutely confused state, staring at his Iron Cross. Elspeth, then just 18, applied to go to Palestine on a capitalist visa, but ran into the same problems as the Meyer Michael. She paid her money into the central bank, but its funds of sterling dried up, and she was told that thousands of people were in a queue in front of her. She might have to wait as much as 5 years before the money would be transferred over. Officials at the Zionist organization asked Foley for help. He gave her a capitalist visa, despite the fact that she did not have the necessary £1,000. And on August the 15th, 1935, she set sail for Palestine with just 10 German marks in her hand. Elspeth's sister, Hilda, emigrated to America in 1938, and a year later, her father and mother were issued with a transit visa to France, from where they joined Hilda in New York. Bertold Khan's elder brother, Paul, was murdered in 1942 in the Oranienburg concentration camp. His younger brother, Hermann, who was married to a non-Jewish woman, was left alone until 1943, when she died and he was taken to Auschwitz and gassed. Elspeth's aunts, Clara and Emma, were deported to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. Clara died of starvation in 1944. Only Emma remained alive to be liberated in 1945. It was not just the Jews who were now in danger. If Frank had any doubts as to his own position, they were dispelled when Captain Thomas Kendrick, the passport control officer and MI6 head of station in Vienna, was arrested by the Gestapo and accused of spying. Kendrick was taken to Gestapo headquarters where he was beaten up and interrogated. Fearing for the safety of Foley and the rest of his staff, MI6 recalled them to London, but within days, Foley had insisted on going back. In April 1938, the British government reintroduced visas for Germans who wanted to come to the UK, further increasing the queues outside Foley's offices. 6 months later, a young Jew, unable to take the persecution of his family, walked into the German embassy in Paris and shot dead a German diplomat. The assassination sparked off what became known as Kristallnacht. Across Germany, it became open season on the Jews. Synagogues were set on fire or blown up. Jewish shops were wrecked and Jews were beaten up in the street. Jewish men were dragged out of their homes and taken to the nearest concentration camp. Many of the leading Jews were forced to go on the run. Foley now embarked on a dangerous path, hiding a number of Jews in his home, including Leo Beck, chairman of the Association of German Rabbis. Given the concern in London that Foley might be arrested as a spy at any time, it was a brave thing to do. At considerable risk himself, Foley allowed Beck to use his home to brief selected foreign journalists on what was happening to the Jews. Meanwhile, Foley's offices on the Tiergartenstrasse were transformed into a place of refuge for those seeking protection from the Gestapo. This is Benno Cohen, chairman of the Zionist Organization of Germany again. 32,000 men were held in concentration camps in those weeks, and their wives besieged Captain Foley in order to effect the liberation of their husbands from the camps. At that time, it was a question of life and death for many thousands. In those days, he revealed himself in all his humanity. Day and night, he was at the disposal of those who sought help. He issued visas of all kinds on a large scale, and thereby assisted in the liberation of many thousands from the concentration camps. Cohen said he and his fellow workers frequently asked themselves why Foley was prepared to lay his life and career on the line to help them. Above all else, Foley was humane, Cohen said. In those dark days in Germany, to encounter a human being was no common occurrence. He told us that he was acting as a Christian. He wanted to show us how little the Christians who were then in power had to do with real Christianity. He detested the Nazis and looked on their political system, as he once told me, as the rule of Satan upon earth. He regarded himself as duty-bound to assist the victims of their misdeeds. A young Dutch Jew called Wim van Leer, who was helping to rescue Jews, had been briefed by the Quakers to make contact discreetly with Captain Foley, who had promised to do what he could to help him. Van Leer found the MI6 head of station to be an extraordinary person with a genuine compassion for the people thronging around the consulate building. The winter of 1938 was a harsh one, and elderly men and women waited from 6 in the morning, queuing up in the snow and biting wind, Van Leer recalled. Captain Foley saw to it that a uniformed commissioner trundled a tea urn on trolley along the line of frozen misery, and all this despite the clientele, neurotic with frustration and cold. Some pleaded, others bribed, threatened, flattered, wept, and threw fits. Captain Foley always maintained his composure. As an ex-army man, he knew that it was fear that motivated the heavy-coated bundles of despair outside his front door, wriggling to escape the closing claw. The assistance Foley offered Van Leer did not just extend to issuing visas for the people he was trying to help. He taught the young men many of the tricks he had learned in his 20 years of Secret Service activity. Foley showed Van Leer where to get false passports for South American republics and which printers would produce fake forms and rubber stamps. Foley also gave him details of MI6 escape routes out of Germany and put him in touch with contacts who could help smuggle the Jews across the border. Throughout 1939, as conditions for the Jews became increasingly hopeless, the British Passport Control Office was inundated with people trying to get out. With the Nazis determined to remove the Jews from Germany, either by forced emigration or worse, the only hope for those incarcerated in the concentration camps was a visa that would prove they could leave. Frequently, Foley would go into the camps himself to save Jews from their executioner. Gunther Plowitzer had been arrested at the beginning of 1937 for race defilement. He'd got his non-Jewish girlfriend pregnant. Plowitzer was jailed for 18 months, during which time the couple's son, Walter, was born. Plowwitzer's brother, who had successfully immigrated to Palestine, set about trying to get him out. Eventually, he was put in touch with Foley, but by now, Pawlowitzer was close to the end of his prison sentence. The day of the release was the most dangerous time for so-called Jewish criminals, who were likely to be moved immediately to a concentration camp. Pawlowitzer was taken first to police headquarters in the Alexanderplatz, and then to the Sachsenhausen camp, north of Berlin. One of the guards in the camp would stand resting an axe on his shoulder as he called out the names of the condemned before they were led away. He was known to the prisoners as the man with the violin. Gunther Pawlowitzer knew his name must soon appear on this list, but continued working in the camp's brick factory, hoping for a miracle. One day he was tipped off by one of the guards not to go to work to plead illness. When he said he was not well, he was sent to the camp kitchen, where a guard forced him to run around with a sack of potatoes on his back. Returning late at night to the hut, bruised and tired, he found it empty. When he asked where everyone was, he was told simply, "They tried out a new machine gun today." A few days later, he heard he had a visitor. An SS guard told him to have a shower and then took him to the clinic where they treated his whip wounds. The SS man then threw a grey overcoat over him to cover up his wounds. He led Gunther into the camp office where a small, owlish-looking man with glasses was sat behind the desk. "My name is Foley," he said in English. "I am from the British consulate in Berlin." Pawlowitzer asked if he could have an interpreter, and when the SS man went out to fetch one, he turned to Foley and told him that he understood English. Foley smiled and said, "Tomorrow you'll be free, and there are papers at the consulate for you to travel to Palestine." "What about my child?" Pawlowitzer asked. "Don't worry, he is also registered on the papers," Foley said. "We've taken care of everything." The next day, someone was waiting at the camp gates to pick Pawlowitzer up and take him to collect his young son. A few days later, they were on their way to Palestine. Foley got out of Berlin on the eve of the German invasion of Poland and was subsequently instrumental in a number of most important Allied wartime intelligence successes. At the end of the war, he returned to Berlin to hunt down the Nazis who had led the persecution of the Jews. He retired from MI6 in 1949, and on Thursday, May the 8th, 1958, at the age of 73, he died of a heart attack. Foley's passing went almost unnoticed in Britain. But as news of his death reached Israel, tributes began to pour in. The list of those who lined up to pay tribute to Foley reads like a who's who of the Jewish community in pre-war Berlin. They included Sigrid Moses and Hans Friedenthal, both former presidents of the Zionist Organization of Germany, Benno Cohen, the organization's chairman, Werner Senator, the Jewish Agency's representative in Berlin, and Robert Welch, editor of the German Jewish newspaper, the Jüdische Rundschau, and a constant thorn in the Nazis' flesh. Hubert Pollack, Foley's friend from Berlin, organized a special fund to plant the grove of trees in Foley's memory just outside Jerusalem. Several thousand trees were planted them, each of them paid for by someone Foley saved. A year later, a team of Mossad officers staged a daring raid on Argentina to kidnap Adolf Eichmann, taking him back to Israel to stand trial for his part in the final solution. The person they chose to ensure they had the right man was Benno Cohen. When Eichmann went on trial in April 1962, Cohen described the reign of terror that followed Kristallnacht and how few people had reached out to help the Jews. There was one man who stood out above all others like a beacon, Cohen said. Captain Foley, the British passport control officer in Berlin, a man who, in my opinion, was one of the greatest among the nations of the world. He was the Pimpernel of the Jews. He brought his influence to bear to help us. It was possible to bring a great number of people to Israel through the help of this most wonderful person. He rescued thousands of Jews from the jaws of death. On October the 24th, 1999, as a direct result of the testimony I collected for this book, Yad Vashem made Foley righteous among nations. Announcing the award, Yad Vashem said it was impossible to tell how many Jews Foley had saved. The closest we can actually get is Hubert Pollack's estimate of tens of thousands. Yet even that extraordinary figure cannot adequately describe the effect of Foley's actions. In a letter to the Jerusalem Post, welcoming the decision to make him a righteous Gentile, one of those helped by Foley wrote, "I myself have 5 children and 18 grandchildren, none of whom would ever have seen the light of day had I not lived. There must be countless men, women, and children who would never have been born had not Foley saved their parents or grandparents. May God bless his memory."
Wow. Michael, thank you so much for such a fascinating and informative overview of a story that requires more than one book to tell. And first and foremost, I'd like to invite our audience to go ahead and purchase the book if you don't yet have it, and enjoy the detail, because this is a story that's all about the detail. You know, obviously the title is grand, it's broad, it's majestic, but the beauty of one of the anecdotes and stories you shared, Michael, of Frank Foley, was he wasn't taken by the big numbers, by the collective, by the grandness of a large-scale mission. He was moved by the pain and the suffering of the individual. The story you shared about how he went himself into a concentration camp and devoted himself to the salvation of that young man and his family, despite, as I've read in the book, thousands upon thousands of individuals who he catered to and was dealing with on a regular basis, demonstrates his attention to the individual. So this is an incredible story of courage, of conviction, of passion, of sacrifice, of humanity. Michael, I want to begin by asking you, what brought you to this story? You're obviously a military man. You're also a novelist. What was it about the story that intrigued you? What brought it to your attention?
Well, I was working on a book on spies. I write mainly books on spies and intelligence. And it was back in the mid-1990s, and a lot of stories, you know, I was writing for the Daily Telegraph at the time, and a lot of stories appeared in the press which were just sort of conspiracy theory, really, you know, and people would write about MI6 or MI5 and not really at the time know too much about it. And it was all sort of fantasy, a lot of it. And it was around that time, for some reason, the intelligence and security services started coming to their senses and realizing they would be much better off if, you know, true stories were told. And I started working on this book because I'd been in intelligence in the army myself. I understood how intelligence worked. And I had an interview with 2 former MI6 officers who at the time were essentially their MI6's internal historians. And you know, they did it rather like, they tended to the archives rather like other people go to their allotments or whatever. And that was the way they looked after the files. And they answered a lot of my questions, and then at the end of the conversation, I said, "Is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have asked you?" And they told me the story of 2 people. I won't go into the other guy; he's not in the same on the same scale as Foley, but they told me about this guy, Frank Foley, who had saved so many Jews from the Holocaust and had never really got the recognition he deserved. And that really, as I said earlier in the talk, is what set me off. You know, if this guy had done all this, why have we never heard of him? You know, and there must be a way of finding out, because trouble is with Schindler, of course, they, you know, famously they all got together after his death and you said we've got to do something for him. With Foley, an awful lot of people, he did it on an individual basis, and an awful lot of people didn't even know they'd had visas they should not have had. You know, people like Hubert Pollack, who was a Jewish social worker, you know, he would have known that this person shouldn't have had a visa, but others didn't. I mean, there was one woman who, her mother, elderly mother, she needed to get her elderly mother out of Germany, and because of the way things worked in Israel at that time, Palestine at that time, you know, you had to be someone who could do something for the nation, who could, you know, add something to the nation. And obviously, you know, a woman in her 70s or 80s was not going to be able to do that. So she wasn't technically able to get a visa. But instead of giving her a visa as her who she was, Foley made them a married couple. He just wrote a visa for a married couple. So they ended up going on a ship to Palestine with a visa that said they were a married couple, the mother and the daughter. It was amazing, some of the things he did.
You know, what's really especially fascinating, and you know, in terms of the contrast, you know, when you read about some of the testimony of Nazis who were later hunted and brought to justice, they very often said, we were just doing our job, as if that were a justification. But in fact, they used it as such. And when you look at Frank Foley, he is such a refreshing contrast, and in a certain sense, the antithesis of just doing your job, if that means, in so doing, allowing large segments of humanity to perish. And that's incredible. I think the beauty of the story is, you know, Frank was raised in the military. He was a military man, an intelligence man. Rules are important, laws are important, the culture, protocol, these are very much celebrated first and foremost as a necessary framework for success. And yet he was willing to suspend it all and do things that were against the law, very creative, and like you just said, marry a couple that weren't married in order to circumvent the legal limitations that would allow them to survive. I find that very moving, actually. Here's a man who stood for the law until the law stood in the way of human life. And I find that to be a very empowering and powerful lesson.
Yeah, it's interesting. The head of MI6, and this letter is in the archives in Kew. The head of MI6, seemingly unaware of what his own man in Berlin was doing, actually wrote to the Home Secretary expressing concern that so many Jews were coming to Britain, because, you know, it might upset the unions, it might upset workers whose jobs were being taken, and there might be riots. And but that's the head of MI6 doing that, and Foley is there in Berlin giving visas out to people.
Exactly. What were some of the risks he took? I mean, clearly he risked his career, I would imagine, if he was caught out or and then disciplined. He was going against the, you know, orders, or at least the laws of or the remit of his particular mission, and his life was on the line, as you mentioned earlier. Some of his colleagues were apprehended and so forth. So I'm wondering if you could share some of the actual risks, some of the actual, I guess, close encounters that he had. And I also wonder whether the Nazis were aware of what he was doing at some point. Was his life ever in danger in terms of, were they ever onto him? Can you share a little bit about the sort of real-time risks that he took?
Well, I think going into going into the camps, and it's interesting because Ian and I subsequently we were talking about the statue that Prince William unveiled, but another guy involved in that whole thing was James Brokenshire, whose father-in-law, he actually got out. His father got out of a camp and got out of the camp, and we think it was Foley that got him out of the camp. From what because he certainly his wife got the visas from Foley, so it's interesting that he's willing to go into the camp. There's not just letting Leo Beck talk to the press in Foley's flat. They also had 2 or 3 people staying overnight, most nights after Kristallnacht, when if you were anything, any male, German Jewish male over the age of 13, 14, was under threat of being taken to concentration camp, and they were quite literally going in, early hours of the morning and dragging Jews away to take them to concentration camps. So 2 or 3 people every night staying in the flat, and amazing stuff. And of course, as I said earlier, he didn't have any diplomatic immunity. This was because the Foreign Office didn't like MI6 around. They didn't regard MI6 as diplomats, which obviously I suppose they weren't. And in those days, there was not the same official cover. The only cover was as passport control officer. It was very dangerous all the time, I think. And the Germans, yes, they did know who he was. They knew he was an MI6 officer. They knew he was head of MI6 in Berlin, because frankly, earlier on, they'd been cooperating with Foley against the communists. The German police had cooperated with, MI6 cooperated with the German police against the communists. And then, of course, you get this new regime, Hitler regime, coming in, and all things change and become very difficult. I can't, I can't give you a sort of James Bond thriller film moment, but yeah, I think people can understand that in those terms, it was very dangerous. In Norway, it was completely different. It was during the invasion, German invasion. So obviously, you're under a different sort of threat of as you are in any war. But in Berlin, it was nasty, pervasive, behind the scenes, not really knowing what was going to happen at any moment, and having really just to live your life through it.
Wow. Let me ask you a question. Did Frank Foley write a diary? Did he share about this period? What do we know about his inner thoughts or his psychology? Or did he share about the tension and the danger and the emotion of that time? You mentioned something really powerful earlier, that he said that he was motivated by his Christianity and his desire to demonstrate that the perverse variety of Christianity, as he called it, Satan, was nothing like true Christianity. And I find that very fascinating and moving. But what more do we know about his inner thought process?
I think he didn't write anything down about himself. He did write down stuff about his colleagues, his secretary, and how she deserved an honor, and that stuff is there. But it's mainly other people speaking about him, and I guess that makes it more valuable in the sense that it's other people telling you about him, and the various people, and there are a couple of dozen people in the book whose stories are told. And Ian mentioned Werner Lachs earlier. I wouldn't have been alive. This man was my personal savior. And they all have that similar attitude. And of course, as I said earlier, there's an awful lot of people will be an awful lot of people who didn't know they'd been saved by Foley, who didn't realise, that this wasn't just some simple mistake that they got the visa they shouldn't have, or they didn't even realise they shouldn't have had that visa. They were helped by him because he believed it was the right thing to do, and so where he did. I mean, I think there is one thing I would say, that there are an awful lot of cases where there were young children, and I think, like any of us, possibility of young children getting dragged into Holocaust, something like the Holocaust, and of course at that stage he had no idea, and no one did. It was well before the time that the Holocaust began.
That's actually a very important point, Michael. The point that, we'd like to believe that, we would have the courage to help human beings in need under these circumstances. But what's really important to note is that Frank Foley started helping the Jewish people he helped before the full brunt of the Holocaust manifested. Obviously, he was helping people in very real need, economic destitution. He saw the writing on the wall, the laws were closing in, but he helped them in the earlier stages, even before the horrifying outright killing machine began, it seems, if I understand correctly.
Yes, yeah, well, but of course their lives were still at risk at that stage, and that horrific bit of testimony from Gunda Purvitzer about the testing of the new machine gun, and this sort of stuff. I think people they think about the Holocaust, but they think of from Wannsee onwards, and the Wannsee Conference is the start of the Holocaust, and nothing that happened before was the Holocaust. But of course, it was all of the same vein, and large numbers of people being killed.
And that's another thing that your book does brilliantly. It really demonstrates, as we were talking before the talk with Vlad, that the economic ruin and destitution, and it brought people to take their own lives, etc. It really tells the full story and the context as well. Someone, Carrie Adina Carmel writes a very beautiful question or point, really. As you mentioned, Foley and his wife hid several Jews overnight at their home. What can you tell us about Mrs. Foley? And it seems she should be recognized in a statue or Yad Vashem as well.
I think, they would need someone who was helped by her, and all of those people will sadly have by now. So I don't think that's going to happen. But it's right. Even as I was talking about Foley and his wife hiding people in their flat, I was thinking more that Foley would not think of himself risking his life. He'd be more concerned for his wife, and she was interviewed after the Eichmann trial. When it came up, when Benno Cohen was talking about him at the Eichmann trial, that's the first time Foley's name gets into the world in Britain, and the Daily Mirror and various other papers write about this man Frank Foley and what Cohen says about being the Pimpernel of the Jews, saving thousands from the jaws of death. That's when people suddenly, and only briefly, but suddenly, hear about Foley. And she wrote for the Birmingham, local Birmingham newspaper. I can't remember, I think it was probably the Sunday Mail, but she wrote a piece on her time in Berlin and her husband, and obviously paying tribute to him, but talking about these people that they hid in their flat, and how these people were so grateful, and they would leave presents for her, and it was just it's a very, very touching article. But it's it was a different world as well. You know, it wasn't it wasn't emotional. Emotions were more repressed, I think, you know, when people were talking about these things. So in a curious sort of way, it has more weight to it, you know, because you see these people minimizing what they did when actually, you know, we know now it was the most amazing stuff.
Right, exactly. And it's really interesting as well that, you know, some years ago we hosted Nick Winton, the son of Sir Nicholas
Oh,
Winton,
right, yeah.
and he told the story of his dad. And there's a similar echo in a way. There's a similar characteristic, a humility, a taking good for granted. No one would know the story until his wife was cleaning the attic and she uncovered these, you know, records of children that he saved. I mean, he kept it from her. Imagine that. This is the decency of the British people. This is the decency of the best of humanity. They did not look at what they were doing as heroism or courageous. They simply looked at it as doing what needed to get done, what the right thing to do. And I think Frank Foley reminds us of that type of characteristic. You know, it's an amazing, amazing added layer of heroism. In other words, there's heroism and courage in itself, and then there's the humility surrounding the heroism and courage. Did you have contact with his daughter, with his family, when you were writing the book, and were you able to get a little bit behind the scenes?
No, because his family, the only family that were still alive were distant relatives. A lot of people in Canada. A woman who was a young niece at the time, but now obviously is much older. And they remembered him, but they didn't have any Berlin contact with him. They didn't have contact with him in Berlin. There was one person, actually a man who was a Christian pastor in America, who was in Berlin briefly, and he told me about what it was like in Berlin. But he gave a hint of it, but of course he wouldn't have known what was going on. He said lots of people coming and going, from the flat at the dead of night. Now, some of those may well have been intelligence agents, just as much as they might have been Jewish people running from the stormtroopers. So you don't, his knowledge as a young boy was, wasn't actually that useful in terms of giving anything more than a flavor of people coming and going at the dead of night.
You mentioned something intriguing, that after the war, Frank Foley went back and engaged in some form of Nazi hunting. Can you share a word or two about that period?
Yes, he was head of the special branch, basically, in Berlin, as an MI6 officer, and they were hunting down significant Nazis. So I don't have any detail of people he actually confronted or met up with, because that stuff is all still secret, and it hasn't even now been released into the archives. So unfortunately, all I can tell you is that he was doing that. His wife did say in the Birmingham Sunday Mail article that he had gone back to the passport control offices, and they've been destroyed in the fighting in Berlin, but he found his safe, and the stuff in the safe was still there.
Wow, that's incredible. Wow. You mentioned that Frank went into the concentration camps. Are there any other events or episodes that brought him into concentration camps to retrieve or to save Jews?
The only one that I've come across is this this one with James Brokenshire's father-in-law, I'm afraid. But of course, it would be odd indeed if he didn't do it on a much more regular basis. It would be odd that he would just do it for one person. And I think, you know, that sort of goes to the German mentality, because if and particularly within the Hitler time, where if you're an SS guard and someone who says they're from the British Embassy comes and says, I need to talk to such and such, I've got a piece of paper here that says I can take him away, you aren't actually going to be questioning that too much if they come forward in a very confident fashion, and it all looks official and it all feels right. So I think there was a lot of, you know, of real chutzpah, I suppose, there in the way he went in there and fronted them up and said, look, you've got to let me go. You get this guy go, because I've got the paperwork here. And thank you very much, you know. And
Right.
if you're an SS guard, you don't want to get in trouble with the people above you. So you don't argue.
There was a very moving comment here from the Tsaitan family. Thank you. We found the story about Frank Foley incredible, and so few people know about this incredible man. I knew the name as my mother was able to get a visa for my grandmother to leave Germany, but unfortunately she had already been moved to Theresienstadt. I believe I still have this document. Thank you, Michael Smith, for giving us the important parts of Frank Foley's life. What a moving comment. It's obviously very sad, but powerful, in as much as there were many people that Frank saved, and unfortunately there were others who it was too late.
Yes, I think when I listed all the members of Bertold Khan's family, you know, it does bring it home to you, because people, you know, because it's not post-Wannsee, people say, oh yes, but it wasn't Holocaust, people weren't dying then. But yes, but if they stayed in Germany, if they couldn't get out, they were going to die, you know, and that's the point.
Exactly. So, Michael, why do you think the story hasn't been told enough? And what are the efforts that you and others are involved in to make this story more known? And maybe to turn it into something a little bit more universally impactful, how can the story potentially be used in schools, in curriculums, etc., in a way that will inspire the next generation to live up to this common human essential decency?
Well, it's not for me to write school curriculums, obviously, but I would have thought, and I think you'll find the Holocaust Educational Trust would say too, that this is precisely the sort of person you want to have kids learning about.
Yeah.
It's a good way of them learning about the sheer horror of the Holocaust, but also a way of allowing them to relate to it, so that they can see, there was this good Brit. But of course, the whole context of Foley is that there were people back in London saying we can't let, the BMA was saying you can't let Jewish doctors in because they'll steal our jobs. That's the BMA. And that was the level it was at. And so that's the context. It's not Britain being wonderful to the Jews at that time. Lots of people were, obviously.
Right.
But it's, elements within the establishment fighting to stop the Jews coming here. Foley is running against that trend, and that's what makes him the exception that he is, really.
And what are some of the efforts to take this story broader? I know we touched a little bit on film. Can you share a word or two about those efforts?
It's been a long running thing. Various people having options, nothing ever coming of it. I have to say I'm very, very much more hopeful now, because Vladimir and Ian have got involved here a bit, and we're looking at it in a way where people who are very influential within the movie industry at last are looking at it and say something needs to be done here. And it's very difficult because you know, Schindler's List has been done, you know, and how do you match Schindler's List? And I think that, you know, the thing with Schindler is, I think Ian was saying before when we were discussing it just between the four of us, that Schindler was a crook and a Nazi, and you know, really, you know, he was on the make, and that's what makes him interesting, because as the time goes on, and you know, he's defending the Jews, protecting them mainly to keep his workforce in place, but gradually it becomes so much more than that. And although he doesn't come out of it as the nicest person on earth, his humanity surfaces, and you know, you get the idea that there is evil in all of us and humanity in all of us, and that's what makes it a great story. The trouble with Foley is that he is human from the start. He is, you know, there is no journey as far as Foley is concerned, from being an evil man, a crook, to being a wonderful saint. You know, he's there all the time, just doing what he would have done, you know, anywhere, in any circumstance where people needed help.
That's a very good point. I was once talking to a filmmaker about a similar type of individual, and they said, well, there's no tension, there's no dark side, there's no struggle, there's no story, you know. But I think we can all agree there's an incredible story of heroism here, and I really truly hope that the story is taken on in the most is professional and far-reaching way. And like I said, if I could be of any assistance, please do let me know. I would really be deeply honored to play a role.
Well, thank you.
I want to just end by sharing a thought, a little bit of a visualization. Going back to Nicholas Winton, I'm sure many of our viewers are familiar with the clip. It's maybe 3-4 minutes, where in his older years, Sir Nicholas Winton was invited to some, like a talk show evening, and at some point the host turned to the audience and said, anyone who was saved through the efforts of this man, can you please stand up? And literally the whole studio stood up. Generations, grandchildren, children, grandchildren, etc. And that's from 650 or so lives saved. I can only imagine what that room would have to look like, its size, its sheer size and scope, and in order to encompass the, by now, how do we know even how to measure? The hundreds of thousands, we will not know. But again, bringing home that beautiful sentiment that Liam Neeson did capture in Schindler's List, when he took off that button and he said, if only I had used this to save one more life. Quoting the words of the Talmud, he who saves one life is as if they saved a world entire. And that really is the message. I think we live in a very, a grand world, a world of numbers, a world that's impersonal, a world that's therefore sometimes inhumane. We're just a number. Social media, it just, we feel small, we feel insignificant, and the individuality of human beings is in a certain sense eclipsed by this you know, these various platforms. And so I feel it's an especially relevant and inspiring message that each one of us in our own lives can channel, as it were, our inner Frank Foley, so to speak. We each have opportunities, sometimes daily, to look past the humanity of the person in front of us, or to look into it, to surface our own sort of, I'm just doing my job. I'm just passing by. You know, I can't take it on. It's not my job. All of the above. And I think that if tonight's story, told brilliantly and written beautifully by our guest of honor, Michael, it resonates with us and we take something from it, it should be that in our lives, in our environments, we try to live up to the legacy Frank Foley left us of humility, compassion, decency, and courage. Is there something, Michael, you would like to share as a final message?
I just, something just caught my eye. Lynette and Morris had asked, did the Foleys have any children? And the answer is that sadly they had one child, a girl, who developed epilepsy. She fell down the stairs in the embassy. She died not long after Kay Foley, her mother. They were living down in Devon, and she'd never married and never had children. So it's interesting as we're talking about all these people who were rescued and their children and their children's children having been saved. Yeah, sadly, there is no direct descendant of Frank Foley.
Well, I think we can say, even though there may not be biological direct descendants, in the broadest sense, there are hundreds of thousands of descendants of this extraordinary individual. You know, the Talmud says something beautiful. It says, he who teaches the child of another is as if he bore him, as if he brought him into being. There's different forms of giving life. Of course, there's biological, there's physical in this case, and there's educational life. And I think, Michael, if I could turn the spotlight on you for a moment, that's exactly what you have done through your book. You have brought a spotlight on an incredible human being. One of the most inspiring, I think, I've read about in many, many years. And thanks to Lord Ian Austin and the various efforts you've made to further bring attention to the various busts and so forth, we thank you for shining a light on this really important story. So Michael, just in conclusion, is there something you think, like a message that you would want to share with our audience?
I think, and we in Britain have been through a period of time when it has been very worrying for the Jewish community, when the party that many members of the Jewish community had always supported all their life suddenly seemed to desert them, and there was a real threat of people getting to power who, well, put bluntly, anti-Semitic. I think that isn't Britain. That isn't Britain at all. And I think Foley now, and at the time he was there was a lot more anti-Semitism in Britain, a lot more racism in Britain, but Foley represents the best of us, I think. And it's one of those books where you feel, writing it, you feel somehow that you have to write it. Somehow there's a sort of destiny that it's you. You know, you have the opportunity to write this. If you don't write it, you'll be failing. You'll be failing people. And it is the one book of all my books, you know, that is, you know, the labor of love. It's where my heart is. You know, I am so proud of this book. I'm so proud of what it's done. And you know, I think that's what we should be doing as writers, trying to, you know, spread a message, to give people something from it that they can take away and take into their own lives. And I think anyone reading Foley and thinking, yeah, this is real, this is the real British spirit. What we've seen over the past half dozen years was not that. And Ian, you know, who was, you know, the most august of those within the party fighting against it, will tell you the same, I'm sure.
That was beautifully said. And I actually think you really essentially echoed Frank Foley's own words when he stood up to what he felt was a misrepresentation of Christianity. And I believe you're essentially echoing that those elements are a misrepresentation of the British decency. And Ian, again, just to take a moment to say thank you for everything you have done. And, you know, it's easy to think of heroism as something that belonged to a different era. I mean, most of us will not be in a situation like Frank Foley, where we'll be literally capable of deciding on who lives and who dies and putting our life on the line to do so. But I think in our modern era and context, I believe there is heroism as well. And Ian, we salute you for that heroism. I just want to say as well, we're honored tonight to have with us Werner Lachs, I believe his name is pronounced, and he himself was saved by Frank Foley. I mean, this is an incredible, a moving opportunity to draw that connection between.
Can we see him on the screen? It would be lovely to see him again.
Well,
Werner, hi. It's so wonderful to see you. How are you?
Here. Thanks to Frank Foley, I'm still here. And I didn't know about him until Michael contacted me. We were wondering whether maybe we got our visa by mistake and somebody else didn't. And it was 30, 40 years afterwards that we found out the truth. So I owe Michael quite a lot of thanks for putting me right on that. Yes, I remember you contacting me through the notice in the AGR newsletter, and you say I was your first contact. Without Foley, where would I be? All I can say is he's my hero, and his book is pride of place in my library. Believe me, I have a family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and thank you for publishing it. It's a wonderful memory.
How many children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren do you have, if I may ask?
Yes, I have 9 grandchildren and 9 great-grandchildren.
Wow.
Yeah, Werner was one of
Wonderful to
those
hear him
where
speak.
there were children involved, and Frank gave the visa out. The name Frank Foley was on the visa, but
Yeah, but I don't know. Unfortunately, I think I mentioned this. My passports were stolen in 1940, so I could never see the signature, which I'm really very unhappy about. But there we are. That's how things are. But how otherwise would we have got here? There was no way we could have got those visas any other way. That's all I can say.
Amazing.
And I'm sorry I wasn't at Stourbridge when we had a meeting, I think last year sometime. It would have been nice to be there to celebrate.
Well,
I'm sorry, Werner, about that, but you'd be very, very welcome. Obviously, when we're allowed to visit, you'd be a very honoured guest to come and see the statue.
Listen, at my advanced age, I don't get around very much anymore, but I accept your invitation with gratitude.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's the beauty and the silver lining of this COVID era, that we can join virtually and we can link, Lord Ian and Michael and Werner, and it's just an amazing circle. And again, I think it very vividly brings to life and light the power of one good deed, the power of one good deed. And this is just an exceptional message for the times. Again, we sometimes think, who am I? What am I? What difference can I really make in the grand scheme of things? And here you have an amazing story of one man saving so many lives through acts of goodness and kindness. I just want to say thank you so much, Michael, for an amazing evening, a memorable evening that I think we'll all take with us. Thank you for writing this book and for your continued efforts to bring awareness to the story. Thank you, Lord Ian Austin, as well, for doing the same. And we look forward, please God, to celebrating this story even further in person, hopefully, at a later date, if possible.
And don't forget the book.
All the best. Good evening, friends.